Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hi everyone, welcome to School's Law. It's Salamatu, and today we are going to be talking about defamation and the tort law. Defamation simply means words said to or about a person which reduces the person in the eyes of right-thinking members of society. It comprises of both slander and libel. Slander refers to when these words are spoken, while libel refers to when these words, which are defamatory, are put in a more permanent form, like in writing. One other difference between libel and slander is that slander is not always actionable per se, which means that in some instances, there is a need to show that some damage has been suffered as a result of the slander. Whereas libel, on the other hand, is always actionable per se. But that is not what today's lesson is focused on. We'll discuss that in part 2 of this topic. There are 3 elements needed to establish defamation. The first one is that the words that have been spoken must themselves be defamatory. I remember when we were defining defamation, we said that it refers to words which have been spoken, which reduces the person it is spoken to or the person it talks about in the eyes of right-thinking members of society. So for the words to qualify as defamatory, the words must be capable of reducing the person they speak of in the eyes of right-thinking members of society. And this was established in the case of Sim versus Stretch. It is the locus for the definition of what defamatory words are, or what we mean by defamatory words. What do we use to determine, what is the yardstick to determine who would think certain words defamatory? The test is the famous reasonable man test, and this was established in the case of Hart versus Newspaper Publishing. In that case, it was established that the ultimate question to ask in any given situation is whether the ordinary reader who comes into contact with these words would think them defamatory. So if we are to go back to our definition of what defamatory words are, will the ordinary reader think that these words that have been said by this particular person would reduce him or would reduce his reputation or status in the eyes of right-thinking members of society? An important thing when it comes to defamatory words is that they don't always have to be direct. They could be by way of innuendo. In other words, they could be an insinuation. So even though they don't exactly, on the face of it, look defamatory, the explanation that can be elicited out of them can give way to a defamatory meaning, and that would equally amount to defamatory words. There are 2 types of innuendos. So we have true or legal innuendo and then false or popular innuendo. So a true or legal innuendo refers to those situations where the words become defamatory when they are viewed in terms of extrinsic facts, or they become defamatory because the reader is aware of certain facts that are not themselves captured within the same statement. The words are not defamatory when you read it, but once you possess a knowledge of certain circumstances, the words would immediately become defamatory because now you are reading those words in light of those certain facts or in light of those special circumstances. This plays out in the case of Cassidy versus Daily Newspaper Limited. In that case, the defendant's newspaper company published a photograph of Mr. Cassidy and a woman, insinuating that Mr. Cassidy was engaged to the woman. The claimant was Mrs. Cassidy, the wife of Mr. Cassidy, who sued the newspaper company, saying that by publishing that picture, they had created an impression to the public that she was only a concubine of Mr. Cassidy and was not actually married to him. The newspaper company argued that they didn't mention Mrs. Cassidy's name, and so that implication or that explanation could not be elicited out of their post. The courts held for Mrs. Cassidy, the claimant, reasoning that people who knew Mrs. Cassidy would make that assumption or would believe the publication or would think that indeed Mrs. Cassidy was living in sin with Mr. Cassidy. So in this case, it didn't matter that the newspaper company did not intend to create the impression that Mrs. Cassidy was a concubine and that she was living in sin with Mr. Cassidy. They didn't even have to mention her name, but then it was defamatory to the extent that it created such an implication to people who were aware that Mr. Cassidy was married to Mrs. Cassidy and that they had been living together. But what makes it fall within the category of a true or legal innuendo is the fact that people would see the photo. People who didn't know Mrs. Cassidy or who didn't know Mr. Cassidy would see the photograph and not think anything. But then people who knew Mrs. Cassidy, you see, that's an additional fact, who knew that they were married, would now begin to think that, so Mrs. Cassidy wasn't married to this man after all. So when you read the publication in light of that extra fact, then the words become, or the publication becomes defamatory. The second category of innuendos is a false or popular innuendo. Now, words that take the form of a false or popular innuendo become defamatory, not because they are being read in light of an extrinsic fact or an extrinsic circumstance, but because some defamatory inference can be made out of it by this ordinary reader that we talked about earlier. So it has been said that a false or popular innuendo goes beyond the literal meaning elicited out of the words, but a deeper meaning inherent in those words. It is no more than an elaboration of the words used without proof of extraneous facts. So in this case, you don't need extra facts to be able to prove that the words are defamatory, or the person in whose eyes the reputation of the person being spoken of or being spoken about is reduced does not need extrinsic facts to think that the words are defamatory. But then, having read them beyond the literal words, this person could elicit a deeper meaning, and that deeper meaning inherent in those words is defamatory. This type of innuendo plays out in the case of Lewis versus Daily Telegraph. And in that case, the defendant's media company published that a certain company and its subsidiaries were being investigated for fraud. The claimant sued the defendant and said that that publication was defamatory. The House of Lords reasoned that there were three possible meanings that could be given to this particular publication. One was that there was an investigation in progress. Secondly, that the claimants were being suspected of fraud. And then thirdly, that the claimants were guilty of fraud. The House of Lords said that only the two were possible, and so they only accepted the two. Now, it is the second meaning, which is that the claimants were suspected of fraud, that the House of Lords said gave rise to a false or popular innuendo, because nobody needed extrinsic facts to be able to derive this meaning out of the publication. Because if there is a publication that a certain company is being investigated for fraud, then it goes without saying that they are being suspected of fraud. Of course, that's why the investigation is going on. So that second meaning is a false or popular innuendo, because once it is being published that a certain company or a person is being investigated for fraud, it presupposes the fact that the person is being suspected of fraud. No one needs external fact to be able to get this understanding out of that publication. And that is what a false innuendo is about. It is not explicit in the words. The publication did not say that so and so company are being suspected of fraud. It said they were being investigated for fraud. But then when you read it, the understanding you would get, and the understanding the ordinary reasonable reader that we talked about in the beginning of this discussion would get is that they are being suspected of fraud, and that is why the investigation is going on. So that is the difference between a false or popular innuendo and a true or legal innuendo. In a false or popular innuendo, there is no need to have knowledge of external facts to be able to think that the words, or to be able to draw the conclusion that the words are defamatory. In true or legal innuendo, on the other hand, there is a need for a certain understanding of extrinsic facts, or a certain knowledge of extrinsic facts, to be able to understand or to be able to even think that those words are defamatory.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.